Hey there! Welcome back to another episode of our Ironweld Great Cannon painting series. Today, we're bringing the Artilleryman to life in the iconic colors of Hammerhal Aqsha. And along the way, we'll be telling the tale of Kalyus Drakon, the Thundercaller. So grab your brushes, ready the cannon, and let's make it count. We've trained for this, and it's time to blast through that pile of gray. This model is part of the Ironweld Great Cannon box set, and belongs to the Cities of Sigmar faction in Age of Sigmar by Games Workshop. While we paint, let me tell you about a man who became a legend among gunners, Kalyus Drakon, a young gunner whose shot would echo through the halls of history. Let's begin on the training fields of Hammerhal Aqsha, where ambition and pressure would forge his reputation. Chapter 1: The Shot That Echoed. The sun beat down on the white stone battlements of Hammerhal Aqsha, its heat a reminder that the city was ever under the watchful eye of the sun god Sigmar. The skyline, a jagged silhouette of spires and towers, gleamed against the morning sky, with the majestic Sigmarite sigil glowing above the heart of the city. Yet down on the training fields below, there was no time for reverence. Today was about testing steel and gunpowder. Kalyus Drakon stood at the edge of the range, his hands gripping the smooth, cool surface of the cannon's ramrod. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck, though it wasn't the heat that made his skin prickle. It was the pressure. He was just a gunner, no more than a youth in the ranks, but today would be different. Today, he would show them all that he was more than a foot soldier with a steady hand. Today, the sun would rise on his future.
"Ready yourself, lad,"
came a gruff voice from behind. Kalyus turned to see Sergeant Kalyus, his mentor and the senior officer in charge of the artillery training. Kalyus was a tall, broad-shouldered man, scarred by years of battle and weathered by time. His armor, a patchwork of brass and steel, gleamed under the sunlight, but his eyes, those sharp gray eyes, held the glint of someone who had seen it all.
"I'm ready, Sergeant,"
Kalyus replied, his voice steady, though his stomach twisted in knots. Kalyus grunted, more out of habit than anything, and turned his gaze toward the practice targets set at varying distances along the open field. Cannonballs lay stacked beside the massive black powder cannons, waiting to be fired. Each one was a monster of destruction, silent, heavy, and hungry for fire.
"We'll start with a basic shot. You know the drill."
Kalyus said, his tone blunt.
"Adjust for wind, range, and elevation. Then fire. Don't rush it. The cannon is patient. You must be too."
Kalyus nodded and bent down, carefully positioning the ramrod against the cannon's bore. His hands were steady now despite the sweat. He could hear the low murmurs of the other gunners behind him, some seasoned, some as green as he was, though none of them had the same weight of expectation resting on their shoulders. The older men knew he was just a trainee, a greenhorn as they called him. But Kalyus wasn't bothered by that. Not anymore. The cannon's muzzle, blackened from years of use, pointed toward the first target, a flat, wooden silhouette in the distance. Kalyus closed his eyes for a moment, recalling everything he had learned. It was more than just firing a weapon. It was a science, a delicate balance of math, nature, and steel. A small shift in angle could make the difference between a precise hit or a wasted shot. He was no mere brute with a cannon. He was a craftsman, an artist with the tools of destruction.
"Adjust for wind first,"
he muttered to himself, feeling the slight breeze tug at his shirt.
"It's coming from the east."
He stepped back and scanned the horizon. The wind had picked up overnight, stronger than usual. The target stood about 400 yards away, and there was no telling how the gusts would affect the shot.
3 degrees east.
Kalyus calculated under his breath, marking the angle on the cannon's iron sight. He then considered the distance to 400 yards. A target that far away would require more than a steady hand. It would take careful estimation of powder charge and cannon elevation.
Elevation 6 degrees.
Kalyus muttered, then glanced at Kalyus, who stood watching from the sidelines. The older man's eyes were narrowed, but there was no sign of impatience in his stance. He knew what Kalyus was capable of.
You're not second-guessing yourself, are you, lad?
Kalyus called, his voice gruff but with a touch of humor. Kalyus blinked, a surge of confidence rushing through him. He shook his head firmly.
No, Sergeant. I've got it.
He stepped forward and began the process of loading the cannon, first with powder, then the heavy shot. As he tamped it down, the muscles in his arms strained. When everything was in place, he wiped his brow, took a deep breath, and set his hands on the linstock. Behind him, the other gunners whispered. Some of them chuckled, but Kalyus didn't care. He couldn't afford to care.
Ready, lad?
Kalyus asked, stepping up beside him. There was a flicker of challenge in the sergeant's voice, but Kalyus didn't falter.
Ready,
he said firmly. With one last glance at the target, he adjusted the angle ever so slightly, his mind sharp and focused. He could feel the weight of the cannon, the knowledge of its power, and the responsibility of the shot pressing down on him. Kalyus lit up the fuse. The explosion was deafening. A thunderous roar that echoed through the range, the ground shaking beneath his feet. The cannon lurched forward, sending the heavy shot flying into the air, trailing a plume of smoke. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then came the distant crack of wood shattering.
Dead center,
came Kalyus's voice, almost a whisper. There was no surprise in his tone, only approval. Kalyus turned slowly, his heart pounding. The other gunners were silent now, staring at him in disbelief.
How did you?
One of them began, but Kalyus raised a hand to silence him.
Don't waste his time asking how.
Kalyus said with a hard smile.
The lad's got a gift. Pay attention, all of you.
Kalyus stood taller now, a sense of pride swelling inside him. It wasn't the first time he had hit the target dead on, but something felt different about this shot. Something clicked deep inside. As he wiped the sweat from his brow and looked back at the target, Kalyus stepped forward, his eyes still calculating.
Not bad for a greenhorn.
The sergeant muttered, his gaze scanning the field.
But I want to see more. You'll have to prove yourself again and again, lad. This is just the start.
Kalyus nodded. It wasn't enough to be good once. He would have to be better. He had proven himself today, but the real test had only just begun. Chapter 2. Under the Watchful Eye. The days blend into each other like the slow drip of water through stone. Kalyus had proved himself once, an accidental stroke of brilliance that had garnered some attention. But now, in the relentless heat of training and the constant clang of war preparation, his true test had only just begun. He stood in front of the massive artillery piece once again, this time not as a novice, but as one under Sergeant Kalyus's keen eye. The grizzled veteran had taken to calling him lad still, but there was an edge to the nickname now, like it carried the weight of expectation. Kalyus could feel it, the way the sergeant observed his every move, his every calculation.
You've got a good shot,
Kalyus said one morning, as they stood in the shadow of Hammerhal Aqsha's northern bastion, overlooking the training grounds. The light wind blew in from the east, fluttering the edges of Kalyus's worn leather cloak.
But that's not enough. Not in a real battle. A good shot doesn't win wars. 1,000 good shots can lose one.
Kalyus nodded, absorbing the weight of the words. The sun was rising over the horizon, casting long shadows across the stone courtyard, where several other gunners were already preparing their pieces. Some of them had given him wary looks ever since his first successful shot. Others had merely grunted, as if dismissing his potential. Kalyus hadn't minded. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here to learn.
Today,
Kalyus continued, his gravelly voice taking on a new seriousness.
we'll work on adjustments. It's more than angles and wind. You need to read the battlefield. Know the lay of the land. Know your enemy, the range, the shifting terrain. When those clouds roll in, and the cannon's barrel is heavy with rain, you'll need to adjust your elevation. When the ground shifts, when the enemy advances, you'll need to shift your strategy.
Kalyus gripped the ramrod with fresh determination. He knew this was a turning point, where the lessons would no longer be simple calculations. This would be where the science of artillery met the chaotic unpredictability of warfare. A lesson in the arcane. For weeks, Kalyus drilled him mercilessly, breaking down the arcane sciences of artillery. They studied the calculations in books, tomes filled with detailed instructions on how to factor in atmospheric conditions, distance, and elevation. It was more than mere angles. It was trajectory, a complex equation of speed, gravity, wind, and powder charge.
You need to learn how to measure the variables before you even fire.
Kalyus said one evening, sitting across from Kalyus by the fire.
Wind speed, humidity, even the curvature of the land. Every calculation is a small equation within a larger one, and you must adjust your shot accordingly. It's not magic, lad, though it may feel like it at times. It's precision.
Kalyus had spent nights in the artillery barracks, hunched over scrolls and charts, his quill scraping against parchment as he calculated the ideal trajectories for hypothetical scenarios. The knowledge was like a web, spinning out before him, and the more he learned, the more questions arose. But it wasn't enough just to know. Kalyus still struggled with translating that knowledge into action. When the targets were still, the calculations were easy enough. But in battle, with artillery smoke thick in the air, the ground shaking with the roar of cannons, it was easy to miss a fraction of an angle. The strain of war. The true test of his skill came far sooner than Kalyus had anticipated. The northern frontier of Hammerhal Aqsha had been under threat for weeks. Khorne's marauding warbands had begun to raid the lands surrounding the city, drawing ever closer to the walls. It was only a matter of time before they turned their bloodied sights on the city itself. A small warband, 300 strong, had been spotted on the plains, marching toward the southern gates. Kalyus had barely been given a moment to prepare, but he found himself standing before a cannon once again, the air crackling with tension. This wasn't a training field. This wasn't a simple test. This was real. His eyes flicked from the cannon to the approaching enemies. They moved in loose formation, and the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows that stretched across the earth. Kalyus stood beside him, silent, but his presence was a weight on Kalyus's shoulders.
They'll reach the walls in less than an hour.
Kalyus said gruffly.
We need to stop them before they get too close. You've learned the theory. Now, you put it into practice.
Kalyus's heart beat faster. His hands trembled slightly as he began to load the cannon. He could feel the pressure mounting with every moment, every breath. This was no longer just about hitting a target. It was about defending the city, saving lives. The crackling air felt thick, as if the very atmosphere was charged with the weight of impending doom. He could feel his breath catch in his throat, the rising panic threatening to cloud his vision. This was no longer just about hitting a target. It was about defending the city, saving lives, and facing the unrelenting truth of battle. And with each heartbeat, the moment of truth drew closer. He couldn't afford to miss. Kalyus steadied himself. He had been trained for this. He realized there was no choice but to press forward. A trial by fire. The first shot was disastrous. Kalyus miscalculated the distance. The target was much farther than he'd anticipated. and the shot flew over the heads of the advancing Khorne warriors, crashing harmlessly into the dirt behind them. His heart sank. Kalyus's eyes narrowed.
Focus, lad.
The sergeant barked, his voice sharp with disappointment.
Get it together.
The ground trembled again, and Kalyus quickly adjusted the angle. He recalculated the wind, remembering Kalyus's instructions to factor in the pressure that low evening clouds would exert on the cannonball. It wasn't just about range. It was about reading the signs around him, listening to the air, watching the movement of the enemy. The second shot was closer, but still wide. Khorne's marauders were closing in, their war cries rising above the distant rumble of thunderclouds. The third shot was crucial. Kalyus closed his eyes for a moment, shutting out everything but the feeling of the wind on his skin, the hum of the cannon beneath his fingertips. He imagined the battle in his mind, the terrain, the movement, the weight of each shot. He recalled the lessons.
Adjust for the terrain. Focus on the lead. Don't hesitate.
This time, he made the calculation quickly, adjusting the cannon's elevation just slightly. He braced himself, his breath steady. He fired. The shot screamed through the air with a power that sent a shockwave through Kalyus's chest. There was no hesitation this time, just pure focus. The cannonball slammed into the heart of the advancing warband, tearing through their formation and sending bodies flying in every direction. The ground shook with the impact, and the Khorne warriors faltered, thrown into disarray. Kalyus's heart raced as the enemy hesitated, their charge broken. Kalyus let out a low whistle, a rare smile curling his lips.
Not bad, lad. Not bad at all.
But the work was far from over. The marauders began to regroup, fury burning in their eyes as they charged once more. The battle had only just begun, and Kalyus knew this was his first true test of leadership, of the science of artillery, and of his ability to adapt under fire. Chapter 3: The Weight of Precision. The first time Kalyus was called before the Artillery Council, he was still wearing his training leathers, the worn, scorched garb of a gunner in the field. His hands were still bruised from the heavy ramrod, and his brow was furrowed with the intensity of the work. But now there was something new in his chest, the spark of recognition. Hammerhal Aqsha's artillery command had begun to take notice of him. The summons had come without warning. No one had warned him about the politics of the artillery corps. The old men in their gleaming plate, eyes hidden behind intricate visors, their words often sharp as the blades of their halberds. But today Kalyus had been called to the council. He didn't know why, only that it had something to do with his performance at Redspire Vale, where the artillery had broken the enemy's flanks and shattered their charge with precision fire. He had led the strike that day. One perfect shot had changed the course of the battle. The Khorne warband had been charging toward the southern gate, their red and brass armor glinting in the fading light. Kalyus had adjusted the artillery's aim, correcting for wind and elevation in mere seconds, bringing down their warlord with a single strike. The remaining marauders had scattered like dust before the wind. It hadn't been luck. It had been precision. Kalyus stood now before the Artillery Council, trying to hide his discomfort. His eyes flicked nervously between the figures seated at the large stone table. At the head of the table sat Lord Artillery Master Obus Kaeldrath, an imposing figure known for his meticulousness with the cannons of Hammerhal Aqsha. Beside him was Commissar Tessa Brightshield, who controlled the strategic decisions of the city, her sharp gaze as much a weapon as the cannons themselves. The others were a mix of seasoned officers and scribes, many older, most far more experienced. And yet here he was,
Gunner Drakon, explain your actions at Red Spire Vale.
Lord Kael'drath said, his voice gruff but not unkind.
The command is impressed by your performance, but we need to understand your reasoning. A single shot that turned the tide of battle. What were you thinking?
Kalyus took a deep breath. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, yet now the words seemed to escape him. He'd thought it would be hard to explain what had happened, but it wasn't. It was simple. He had calculated the shot in his head almost as if it were instinct. The angle of the cannon, the wind, the elevation, the speed of the charging warband. All of it had come together in a matter of heartbeats.
I adjusted for the wind, sir.
He said steadily, his voice stronger than he felt.
I knew the marauders were trying to push through our line, and that they had limited cover. The target was moving fast, but I figured if I could predict their speed and distance, I could bring them down with one hit. The wind was coming from the east, so I adjusted by 3 degrees. Elevation, about 6 degrees. The rest was just timing.
There was a long pause.
Impressive,
Commissar Brightshield said, her voice cool and calculating.
the precision of your shot was extraordinary. But this is not a common field battle, Drakon. The war on the Southern Front will require more than just a single shot. It requires strategy, coordination. How can we trust your decisions under the pressure of a siege? Can you manage the forces at your command? Not just the artillery piece itself.
Kalyus blinked. This was the real question. This wasn't about a single shot. This was about leadership. He swallowed hard and answered with confidence, but not arrogance.
I can lead the gunners, Commissar. I know how to read the battlefield, terrain, weather, enemy movements. If you trust me, I'll give you results, not just theory.
There was silence again as the council exchanged looks. Kalyus could feel their judgment on him, weighing heavily. It was a moment that would decide his future. Finally, Lord Kael'drath stood.
We will give you a chance, Gunner Drakon. You are no longer just a gunner. You are to be promoted to First Artillery Officer. The city is in need of fresh minds. You will oversee training and artillery deployment for the Southern Front. Prove your worth there.
Kalyus felt the blood rush to his head. He'd been promoted. First Artillery Officer? It was almost too much to believe. He was no longer a simple soldier. He was now a leader, a strategist, tasked with the responsibility of his comrades and the city itself. The science of precision. As the days passed, Kalyus threw himself into his new role. The study of ballistics became more than just a daily duty. It became an obsession. He pored over tomes from the Sigmarite universities, ancient works on the arcane sciences of artillery. There, amidst the dense text, he discovered the hidden patterns that govern trajectory, how the flow of magic in the air could influence the flight of cannonballs, how mystic powders could enhance the force behind each shot. For the first time, Kalyus felt he was truly becoming a ballistician, a master of both science and craft. He no longer relied only on his instincts and quick thinking, though those were still vital. Now his mind was steeped in arcane formulas, calculations that allowed him to predict with incredible accuracy the flight of a cannonball under any condition, no matter how unpredictable. In addition to the practical knowledge, he began to learn how to lead. He trained new recruits, breaking down the art of artillery into bite-sized lessons. He knew that the key to victory didn't lie in just the gunpowder and steel, but in how those forces were deployed, how the fire was directed and sustained over a battlefield. Rivals in politics. But not all were pleased with his rise. Not all welcomed his new title. In the shadow of Kalyus's promotion, there was Captain Erix Valner, an experienced officer who had long been known for his unshakable belief that traditional methods of artillery were the key to Hammerhal Aqsha's success. Valner had little patience for Kalyus's newfangled methods. those theories and adjustments based on wind and magical influence. To him, it was all just superstition.
It's not about science, Drakon.
Valner said to him one evening in the training yard, his tone laced with contempt.
It's about experience, firepower, the tried and tested ways. You may have impressed the Council with your so-called precision, but we fight a real war out there. And I'll be the first to say, your methods won't win us this war.
Kalyus stood his ground.
I believe in precision, Captain. Every shot counts. We can't afford to waste them.
Perhaps.
Valner spat.
But I'm not going to sit back and watch you lead us into the grave with your fanciful theories.
The tension between them simmered, each word a challenge. It wasn't just Valner. There were others, too, who questioned Kalyus's rise. Some believed in the old ways, while others, like Kalyus, had begun to see the potential for something more. A future where artillery wasn't just brute force, but a precise and measured science. Chapter 4. The Thunder Before the Storm. The air had a strange, acrid taste to it, thick with the scent of sulfur. Kalyus Drakon stood atop the northern walls of Hammerhal Aqsha, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. The air itself seemed to shimmer with tension. The city had been on high alert for weeks, watching as chaos and destruction warbands closed in from all sides. But now it was no longer a matter of when they would strike, but how. The rumble of drums reached his ears first, low, foreboding, then the growls of war horns. The enemy was close. Too close. Lord Artillery Master Kaeldrath had summoned Kalyus to the command center hours ago, and together they had scoured maps of the city's defenses. Hammerhal Aqsha's southern gates were still held, but the northern ramparts, the weakest point, had been exposed during the last raid. Now, a massive chaos horde was amassing just beyond the city's walls. Marauders, Ogirma tribes, and a slaughter brute, its great maw snapping hungrily as it chewed through the land, crushing everything in its path.
We'll hold the city with artillery,
Kaeldrath had said.
but you're the one who will decide if we survive this.
The weight of the responsibility was suffocating. As Kalyus paced along the wall, his mind raced. The city's cannons and war machines had already been set in position. He had overseen every detail of the artillery placement, the adjustments for range, elevation, and wind. But this was a different beast entirely. To destroy the slaughter brood of Khorne, to break the heart of the chaos forces, would require more than just knowledge of angles. It would require perfect precision and perfect timing. He stood now before a towering cannon, the Sky Shatterer, one of the largest artillery pieces ever built in Hammerhal Aqsha. Its barrel was etched with sigils of Sigmar and filled with rune-carved powder chambers, ready to unleash a devastating payload of molten iron shot. Kalyus's hand rested lightly on the barrel. This weapon was his responsibility now.
Do you trust your calculations, lad?
Kalyus's voice broke through his thoughts. The old sergeant stood beside him, now a senior officer, his face weathered by battle and time.
You've trained for this. I've seen you work your magic. But now...
Kalyus paused, scanning the enemy forces in the distance, his eyes narrowing.
Now we need more than numbers. You'll need a guiding hand from Sigmar himself.
Kalyus nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. He knew what Kalyus meant. To make the perfect shot against such a massive target, especially one that was constantly moving, tearing through the earth itself. It wasn't just science anymore. It was magic, or more specifically, the power of Sigmarite sorcery embedded in the cannons, woven into the sigils, and carried in the form of arcane powder. The calm before the storm. The battle began just after dusk, when the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon. casting the sky in deep red and purple hues. The drums of war grew louder, the shrieks of Khorne's warbands piercing the night air. Kalyus's hands were steady, his mind racing through the calculations, the distance, the wind, the angle. Ahead, the slaughter brood emerged, a mountain of muscle and bloodlust. Its hulking form towered over the battlefield, veins of fiery red pulsing beneath its dark, scarred hide. The gaping maw of the creature stretched wide, rows of jagged teeth glistening with fresh blood. Its glowing red eyes burned with an insatiable hunger. Massive, corded limbs ended in claws like battle axes, while obsidian-like armor and spiked bone adorned its body, every inch a weapon forged for war. A massive whip-like tail lashed the air, and chains of skulls swung from its back, a horrific banner of Khorne's madness. Behind it, an army of Khorne's marauders surged forward, a tidal wave of blood and violence, charging toward the northern gates. Kalyus felt the weight of the moment. The slaughter brute and its followers were relentless, but he had one shot to stop them. The artillery pieces were primed and ready. Kalyus's plan was simple but deadly. If the cannons could take out the monster, the rest of the horde would falter. But the slaughter brute was moving too fast, too erratic, too close to the walls.
Sky Shatterer is ready, sir,
Called one of the gunners, breaking Kalyus from his reverie. He turned to find Sergeant Kalyus standing nearby, eyes fixed on the enemy with the same calm demeanor as always.
Give me your readings, Sergeant.
Kalyus said, voice sharp. Kalyus didn't hesitate.
Wind is at 3 degrees to the northeast, with a slight updraft near the monster. Distance to target, 300 yards.
Kalyus's mind raced, adjusting for the wind, the distance, the rise of the ground as the slaughter brute approached. But the calculations were off. The slaughter brute was a living, breathing beast of chaos. Its movements were erratic, unpredictable. No formula could account for that kind of chaos.
I need more time.
Kalyus muttered under his breath. But time was a luxury he didn't have. Science meets magic.
Do you want a guiding hand?
Kalyus asked, his voice low.
Call upon Sigmar's light.
Kalyus's eyes flickered to the barrel of the Sky Shatterer. He had studied the Sigmarite runes carved into it, learned how they channeled arcane energy into the shot. But now, with the monster charging toward the walls and the fate of Hammerhal Aqsha hanging in the balance, Kalyus realized that the only way to succeed wasn't through the science alone. It was time to combine both. He closed his eyes, focusing on the sigils of Sigmar embedded in the weapon before him. The symbols pulsed with faint light, as if alive. He reached out, focusing his will, and invoking the sigils in the ancient tongue. The runes flared bright, and for a brief moment, Kalyus felt the will of Sigmar itself flowing through him, channeling not just his knowledge of the artillery, but the power of the God King. The sigils on the cannon began to glow, a golden aura surrounding the barrel. Sigmar's fury would guide the shot. With his heart pounding in his chest, Kalyus gave the order.
Fire.
The cannon erupted in a burst of flame and thunder. The shot tore through the air with unimaginable speed, the golden light of Sigmar's magic tracing its path through the clouds of smoke and dust. For a heart-stopping moment, Kalyus could see nothing but the blur of the missile as it traveled toward its target. Then, with a deafening boom, the shell impacted the slaughter brute. The blast was like a thunderclap. The earth trembled beneath Kalyus's feet. The massive beast let out a shriek as molten iron tore into its flesh, exploding outward in a shower of gore. The slaughter brute faltered, its charge momentarily halted as the blow cracked its armored hide. The force of the impact sent waves of shock through the surrounding horde, breaking their charge. The marauders, for a fleeting moment hesitated, faltering, unsure. Victory in the balance. Kalyus barely had time to breathe before he gave the order for a second shot. The slaughter brute was down, but not defeated. The Khorne War Band was still surging forward, their fury undimmed. But now, with the monster wounded, the morale of the enemy was shaken. The artillery continued to fire, each shot finding its mark with stunning accuracy, as Kalyus directed fire with precision. The city's defenders rallied, and slowly, the tide of the battle began to turn. The Khorne warriors broke, some falling back, others scattering in confusion as the horde lost its momentum. When the last of the enemy forces fled or were cut down, the battlefield fell eerily silent. The storm had passed. The chief Ballistician. Hours later, as the fires of the battlefield smoldered and the last of the wounded were carried into the city's healing halls, Kalyus stood before Lord Artillery Master Kael'drath and Commissar Brightshield. The battle had been won, thanks to Kalyus's unorthodox use of Sigmarite magic, precise calculations, and sheer determination.
You have earned our respect, Drakon.
Lord Kael'drath said, his voice heavy with approval.
The city stands because of your actions today. From this day forward, you will serve as Chief Ballistician for the city of Hammerhal Aqsha.
Kalyus bowed his head, the weight of the title settling onto his shoulders. It was a responsibility unlike any he had ever known. The city had survived, but the work was far from over. There were always more battles to be fought, more wars to win. And now, with his new title, Kalyus would have to guide the city's defenses with the same precision and knowledge he had used to save it. But for now, as the last remnants of battle smoke faded into the twilight sky, Kalyus allowed himself a single breath of relief. Hammerhal Aqsha was safe. For now. Chapter 5: A New Era of Artillery. The massive steel doors of the artillery chamber creaked as they swung open. The air inside was thick with the scent of oil, iron, and the faint tang of burning magical runes. The city's vast arsenal of artillery was housed here, from towering cannons and hellblasters to smaller field guns, each crafted with precision by Hammerhal Aqsha's finest engineers. Yet despite the centuries of tradition that lay within these walls, the space now felt different to Kalyus. More alive, more focused. He strode forward, his boots echoing on the stone floor. His new title, Chief Ballistician, still felt strange on his tongue, but the weight of it was something he had come to understand. With it came not only the responsibility of leading the city's artillery forces, but also the responsibility to guide the future of warfare itself. And with the world around them constantly shifting, torn by the ever-present threat of chaos and destruction, the time had come for change. His fingers brushed against the barrel of a newly constructed arcane cannon, one of his own designs. This was the future, a weapon forged through the marriage of science and Sigmarite magic, the blending of precision and power that would define the next era of warfare. The cannon was unlike any before it. Its etched runes pulsed softly with an inner light, and the very air around it hummed with magical energy. Since the battle against the slaughter brute and the successful defense of the city, Kalyus had worked tirelessly to redesign the city's artillery doctrine. No longer would the forces of Hammerhal Aqsha rely solely on brute force and outdated tactics. He had pushed for greater integration of magic into their weapons, as well as refining their strategies to be more dynamic, adapting to the changing nature of warfare and the ever-evolving tactics of their enemies. Under his leadership, the city had begun to revolutionize its artillery divisions. New technologies, new training methods, and new doctrines were all part of the plan. No longer were they just gunners, They were ballisticians, blending magic, mathematics, and warfare into a cohesive whole. Kalyus had introduced a new curriculum for young recruits, one that emphasized not just the practical use of artillery, but a deep understanding of arcane mechanics and tactical versatility. The Sigmarite sigils embedded in each weapon had become more than just decorative. They were living things, conduits for power, that could be shaped by those who understood their true potential. Kalyus had spent countless hours in the city's arcane labs, working alongside engineers and sorcerers to unlock the deeper secrets of the runic energies. And in the process, he had discovered that, with the right application of Sigmarite magic, artillery could achieve feats that had once been thought impossible. Yet, despite the advancements, Kalyus never forgot the simple wisdom he had learned during his years as a humble gunner. He remembered the lessons of precision, the quiet moments of reflection before a shot, the patience required to calculate the perfect angle, the need to adjust on the fly when conditions changed. It wasn't enough to have the finest tools or the most powerful magics. In the end, it was always about precision, the ability to adapt, to read the battlefield, and to make every shot count. Reflections on the path taken. As Kalyus stood before the latest addition to the city's arsenal, his thoughts turned inward. He had come a long way since those early days in the training fields of Hammerhal Aqsha. He thought back to his first battle as a gunner, the first time he had calculated a firing solution and watched as his cannonball hit its mark. He had been young, untested, and full of ambition, but now, years later, he had become the city's chief tactician, revered not just for his technical prowess, but for his ability to inspire and lead. He thought back to his mentor, Sergeant Kalyus, whose gruff advice had steered him through the toughest moments of his career. Kalyus had taught him that leadership wasn't just about knowing the numbers or understanding the weapons. It was about knowing your men, your comrades. It was about earning their trust and understanding the value of each individual in the larger scheme of things. It was this lesson that had truly shaped Kalyus into the leader he had become. There had been many challenges along the way, of course. Captain Valner, who had once scorned Kalyus's methods, had never fully embraced the changes Kalyus had brought. But even he had come to grudgingly respect the new artillery doctrine after witnessing its effectiveness firsthand during the last defense of Hammerhal Aqsha. The war against chaos was one of attrition, a constant push and pull, and the forces of destruction had learned to fear the precision of Kalyus's artillery units. And yet, despite the victories, Kalyus knew that the war would never truly end. There would always be new threats on the horizon, new challenges to face, new enemies to defeat. But he felt a renewed sense of hope for the future, knowing that the city's forces were stronger, smarter, and more unified than ever before. The legacy. Looking out over the city from the high balcony of the Sigmarite fortress, Kalyus felt the weight of the future press against him. He knew that the artillery would always be a part of his legacy, one built on precision, knowledge, and a relentless desire to push the boundaries of what was possible. But perhaps more than that, he had helped forge a new mindset in the city's defenses, one that blended the old ways with the new, one that embraced the future without losing sight of the fundamentals that had first brought the city victory. As he turned away from the balcony, his eyes fell on a young gunner who had just entered the room, perhaps a future chief ballistician, a young mind eager to learn.
"I'll be with you in a moment,"
Kalyus said, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The next generation was waiting to be shaped, and he would help guide them, just as his mentors had done for him. They would build on the foundations he had laid, taking Hammerhal Aqsha's artillery to new heights, to greater precision, and to even more extraordinary feats. The war against chaos and destruction would continue, of course. But with every shot fired, with every cannonball that sailed true, Kalyus knew that the future of Hammerhal Aqsha, and perhaps the future of the entire realm, was secure in the hands of those who understood the value of precision, of knowledge, and of adaptability. A new era of artillery had begun. We hope you enjoyed today's painting session and the story of Kalyus Drakon, the Thundercaller, that we've crafted for this episode. Note that this is entirely fan-created material for entertainment purposes and is not part of the official Age of Sigmar lore. That's all for today's painting session. You can find the list of colors we used in the video description below. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider giving us a like and subscribing. In the next episode of this sub-series, we'll be painting the accessories to complement the Ironweld Great Cannon. Thanks again for joining us in our quest to conquer the gray. And as always, keep on painting. And take care.